Hello and welcome to another episode of Attacking Third, a CBS Sports soccer podcast. I'm Sandra Herrera, lead NWSL writer for CBS Sports, joined today, as always, by my colleague and co-host Lisa Roman, broadcaster and analyst for CBS Sports. Today, we're also joined by a special guest and friend of the show, Lori Lindsey, former United States U.S. Women's National Team midfielder. We're so happy to have her on here because we have to talk about a historic day for the United States Women's National Team. The U.S. Women's National Team Players Association, the U.S. Men's National Team Union also agree with U.S. Soccer on historic CBAs for each respective player unions. We're just going to hop right in. I got to ask for first reactions to the news. Lori, I'm going to go straight to you for it. How are you feeling today?
Yeah, I mean, freaking pumped and so thrilled about this. I mean, when we talked about the CBA months ago for the NWSL, I think I was like getting a little bit teary-eyed. And so, I feel the same here. I feel thrilled for what the potential to come, and then also just in the moment of like, hell yeah, this is awesome, right? Like this is for both sides, for both the men and the women. I mean, I think that's no doubt the important thing here.
Lisa, first reactions for you.
I'm impressed and happy and so overjoyed for these players, but I'm impressed that it came 2 months after the settlement happened, because that happened in mid-March between the Players Association and the US Soccer Federation about the equal pay claims in litigation. After 6 years of that battle back and forth in court, there was terms of a settlement that were contingent on a CBA, and a lot of the talk at the time was like, yes, we got the settlement, but now we got to get the CBA between the men's side and the women's side, and U.S. Soccer and U.S. Soccer Federation. And now that has happened just 2 months later. It's all really falling into place, and these terms are great. I memean, it's equal pay across the board. That's like the main billboard for this, which is huge.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that for sure, because I think maybe that's been something that's been lingering, I think, in the back of people's minds. I know in the back of our minds, we've been talking and chatting a lot about collective bargaining agreements. I feel like it's been for really the last several years, but it's kind of escalated, I think, at the height of 2022 when, Laura, you mentioned it. We talked a little bit and got misty-eyed a bit over the National Women's Soccer League Players Union going ahead and ratifying their first ever CBA. And just the timeline of this one as well, like they're just having this years-long battle with the United States Women's National Team and U.S. Soccer, and very open, very public, right? A lot of headlines around that type of back and forth. And sometimes, you're looking at a players union get dragged through some headlines. You're looking at a federation get dragged through to some headlines. But I think when that settlement or the agreement to settle got announced, we're talking just in February of this year in 2022, there was an agreement to settle between these two parties. After the 6-year legal battle, the terms of that settlement included $22 million to players who were named within the case, and then ultimately the federation also agreed to establish a players fund with $2 million to benefit players during their post-soccer careers and invest in charitable efforts that were aimed at growing the sport for women. So that in itself, I remember us hopping on here and celebrating that. Like this was something, it was just, and that was just an agreement to settle. We were like, yes, like let's talk about like big strides here. But within that, there was this promise, right? This promise that, hey, we are also going to provide an equal rate of pay for both the men and the women's national teams. And that includes the big one, the World Cup bonuses. But the whole little thing in between all that was that it was a promise. And it was a promise not only but it was contingent on something else. So it had to be that these two unions had to come together to ratify their own new respective collective bargaining agreements. So knowing this, I'm going to go to you again for this one, Lori. On the player side of things, you can talk to us from a time and place where that maybe necessarily wasn't the case. When you're looking at, fighting for your rights as a player in this space, a lot of times when we've heard from former players and former collective bargaining negotiations, it's always been trying to grow the space, to fight for your rights within it. But this concept of having to work alongside this closely with the men's national team, this is maybe a bit of a first. Talk to me about maybe going from prior negotiations, things that you maybe were used to being in the rooms on, to sort of seeing this come to fruition now.
Yeah. Well, Lisa and I were talking off air as well, kind of about that, right? Instead of like just working in silos, like this isn't just the women's national team's fight; it's everyone's fight. And so, I remember back in like 2000, getting a call, I was like playing with the U21 national team or something, and it was like Julie Fatty and Mia and everybody was calling, right? Because they're going to go on strike to like get better pay. There's still like better uniforms, better resources, and it was like, please don't. If you get called in, don't go. Right? This has to be a collective effort. And so those are the types that I remember, right? That is in a CBA, but that is like, hey, we're in this together collectively. Like we all have to be on the same page to be able to move this sport forward and leave it better than not just for like the players that are playing now, but for future generations. And then come into my time when I was playing frequently with the national team, it did feel like we were constantly in the fight alone. And there was a constant dialogue of like, okay, like why aren't the men engaged? Why aren't we, whether that's correct or not, right? There just wasn't a lot of communication between the two teams. And I feel that is the biggest point in this, right? Like, hell yeah, for the like equal pay and directly across and everything else that people can read about the specifics in there, right? Like, yes, amazing, right? But I think just in general, the collaboration of the two teams and behind the scenes is like one of the biggest things, because I mean, you look at anything that's going on in this world, it's not the individual groups fight, right? It's collectively, what is everybody doing? And I've said that about the men's team, and that's not a knock, right? It's just more about like, how do we continue this dialogue forward? And so to me, to have both of these U.S. men's and women's national teams together, I think is setting a precedent for going forward, but also it is going to take some people, or it is going to have some people globally stop and look and be like, what's going on there? How can we move forward? And I think there's good things to come, which is like the biggest thing for me. I think it's huge.
Yeah, I mean, that's such a good point about how everyone else in the world now is looking at U.S. Soccer Federation, because it is setting the precedent, having the men's and the women's team in collaboration, working together, coming to terms on things that benefit both sides, not just one side. And it's not taking one from the other to give to one. It's a collaboration and coming to these equal terms. You touched on this a little, Lori, but I want to pick your brain about the future, because as you mentioned, back in 2000, it was not going to a camp that you're being called into to kind of set the tone and as a wave that everyone is in this together. And now that this collaboration comes between the men's side and the women's side, there is a CBA. What does this look like moving forward, especially because we're coming into a World Cup year for the men, World Cup qualifications this summer for the women, and then in 2023, the Women's World Cup. So what does the future landscape of U.S. soccer look like right now?
Yeah, well, to me, exciting. I mean, I've been saying this, like, I think we got this question asked during the draft, whether expansion or college draft, about like players starting to sign directly with their clubs, right? Because all of this is intertwined. So like when I think about U.S. soccer, I do think about the NWSL. I can't speak as much directly to the men's because that is a bit more in place, right, with how their club teams work and stuff. But in particular with like NWSL, and that is a direct link to a lot of these players, I think the growth, the ceiling is substantially high, right? Of what I don't even know if we can imagine what this could look like. I mean, before the all these national team players had their contracts through the national team, right? And so that automatically sets like a hierarchy on like what is important and what's not. And I think that has always held back whatever league was in place at that time, because basically you have 30 players, and that's stretching it, making a living off of soccer, and the others aren't, right? And now players are going to be signing with their individual club teams. It's on the individual clubs to develop those players and what that looks like. They can sign directly. And I think that one just creates more growth, that creates more excitement. I think that draws more attention globally for international players to come over, because there's fewer restrictions in what that looks like. I think it equals the playing field globally as well, because our U.S. women's national team's not going in for 8 months prior to a World Cup and training together. So, like, I mean, awesome in the past, right? But, like, let's be honest, that is, like, a bit odd. And also you just allow, I think, for the women, I had this thought before, which is, and now I've lost it a bit, but for the NWSL, you now have created, like, there's not going to be that hierarchy. So I think we've got to get away from, yes, the U.S. women's national team is special to play for, right? That's awesome. And Lisa, you and I talked about this on the U.S. women's national team hour, but, like, playing professionally and being able to make a living at, like, in women's sport is, like, that to me is the topic, right? And, like, let's get away from, if you don't play on the national team, then you're not a good soccer player, because that is not it anymore, right? That's just not it. And so to me, that changes the whole dialogue around the NWSL, women's soccer in the United States, and I think that just continues to push the game forward. Because the point I'll say is the U.S. women's national team, what I am most, like, grateful for about being part of this team is this forward thinking and pushing the envelope and understanding the platform when you play on this team and what that means in terms of leaving the game better. And globally, federations do look to see what's going on here in the United States. And this is a moment for them to certainly be paying attention.
I love that you brought up. I love how you said it too. You're like, these two things that, like, aren't necessarily the same. It doesn't mean that one is more or one is less when we're talking about playing for country versus playing for club, and sort of the mindset around that has kind of shifted a little bit. I mean, I remember it wasn't too long ago. It was during March for Women's Month. We had Sam Ewis on here. We were chatting a little bit with her about Title IX and the impacts of that, and we also chatted about the potential for now this new contract that we're talking about here. At the time, they were still in the early phases of just agreeing to that settlement with U.S. Soccer, and then the next round was having to get on calls or get into meetings, with their compatriots in the U.S. men's team to sort of hammer something out here. And we had asked her, and she mentioned that. She mentioned that the league specifically, this concept of something that they really want within this next CBA is this sort of balance between, club and country. And we're seeing some of that within this new CBA that finally got announced. Let's maybe go over some of these bullet points in here that kind of stick out and get some reactions a little bit. Obviously, the biggest one is this, the concept of equal pay for equal work. And I chuckle a little bit because it just, even saying it out loud, it sounds so simple, but in the back of my head, I'm like, this has been fought for decades, quite frankly, and really escalated maybe over the last 6 years to now 6 months, right? But this concept of equal pay for equal work, for, international friendlies, players on both teams are going to be paid identical roster appearance fees and performance payments based on the outcome of the match and the rank of the opponent, with identical tiering structures. Players not on the game roster will earn the equivalent of an appearance fee for their participation in a senior national team camp. For official competitions, including the World Cup, both teams will earn identical game appearance fees. For official competitions other than the World Cup, both teams will earn identical game bonuses. USWNT players will no longer receive guaranteed salaries, and those who play in NWSL will no longer have their NWSL salaries paid by U.S. Soccer. We touched on that last one a little bit right now, but even for those first 2 points that I just mentioned right now, under this phrasing of equal pay for equal work, I'm looking at that, and when I saw that, I was like doing a little bit of a victory dance too, because something else that we've seen in these last, recent cycles, we'll just say, this shift, even starting with Jill Ellis, now into Vlatko Andonovski. I remember so often times, the excitement around expanding the player pool even just a little bit, even when we just saw, for example, this kind of experimentation that was happening at the outside back position, when we saw a number of players getting called in forwards getting called in specifically, shifting them lower into the back line to sort of see what worked before Crystal Dunn was a revelation, apparently. And I remember so often a time where you only can dress a certain amount of players on a game day. And that means the other handful of players are not going to be, accessible for in-match substitutions or anything like that. So when I saw something like that, I was thrilled. So this concept of getting a call in, right? Or being recognized for your efforts at the club level, getting called in and being part of a training camp isn't just this honor anymore. It's not just like a stamp on your book anymore. It's coming with some dollar signs behind it. And for me, I was thrilled to see that, especially for this is a point for both teams here. But I know for us, we're speaking to this from the U.S. Women's side. So I'm thinking of those early days when somebody like a Sophia Huerta was constantly called in, or even a Taylor Smith was called in, or a Casey Kruger, or even fast forwarding to now with so many of these kind of next gen players kind of coming in, and maybe not necessarily getting into these training camps and not necessarily seeing the minutes. That's going to look different for so many of these players moving forward. And that was a big point for me when I was looking at this, that I was celebrating. Lori, what is like even just the economics of the financial impacts of that? What does that like mean for young players as they kind of get like this call up now, go into these training camps just to try to impress coaching staffs? Talk to me a little bit about that mindset going in there doing that, but now there's going to be, some dollar signs behind that for them.
Yeah. I mean, well, listen, I think it just opportunity is where it's at, right? There's just so many more opportunities, and that pathway looks very different. You said it perfectly, Sandra, in the past too. I mean, if you were in the mix, if you were in that kind of like 30 player pool, awesome for you, because it was also difficult to get you off. So you were like, quote unquote, safe in some ways, but like, also, like, even when I say that, I want to cringe a little bit, because I had the luxury of like being in that position, right? And I also understood what it was like not being in that. Like, I had the fortune to understand both sides, which I think gives me an interesting perspective. However, it's like when you think about it, 30 players, right, that were like making some sort of like kind of like substantial money playing professional soccer, playing on the U.S. Women's National Team, but like 30 players, are you kidding me? Like, that is so ridiculous.
Yeah.
And so now, when we talk about like financial, yes, no doubt, like pay the players, let's go. Like that is like my number one like thought, right? Enough is enough. But I'm also like, I think about the opportunities, because within this is we're seeing what's happening in the game of in women's soccer globally currently, and it feels like we've all been screaming this for however long, right? And now it's kind of like catching traction. But like within like money and financially, I also see again opportunity of like what this looks like. Is there going to be expansion? Is there more opportunity for players? And then because you're not so like, I don't really love to use the word handcuffed, but like for lack of a better word, like they're not, the coaches aren't, right, to just these players. Like that opens up so many more avenues for players to get called in, to go a different direction if you're a coach. So ultimately that's what I'm most excited about, and I feel like is the most exciting going forward.
Equal pay in this, and that terminology is the headline, and that's the biggest thing in this. And then World Cup prize money is also a huge headline, which is the very first time an agreement of that scope has been put on the table. But there's also so many other points throughout this CBA that are important in different broadcast sponsorship revenue sharing. That's going to be split 50-50%. National team benefits, 401ks, childcare during
and childcare for the men too, which is hugely important, right? Like,
yes. So there was always childcare for the women's national team during the national team camps provided, but now they've opened that up to be for the men's side as well. And like that part of is huge. Playing and training surfaces, accommodations, travel, schedule predictability of all these other points that aren't just equal pay and equal World Cup bonuses, Lori, of these other points in travel predictability and training surfaces and airline travel, what of those sticks out to you the most? I know you jumped on the childcare thing.
Yeah, well, I think that's massive, right? And that was something that it's been talked about on Twitter this morning, and something that probably would get overlooked. But I do think that is hugely important. Just I think the resources that it's really, I think all of this again goes back to my point about collaboration and not operating in silos and bringing both teams to the table, right? I mean, ultimately, it was getting the men's team in the conversation and what that looks like, because I think it gets everybody more engaged, right? And that ultimately is the goal, is because when you know, then you can't unknow a lot of stuff. And so if you are continuously not engaged in the dialogue that had been happening with our U.S. Women's session, this has been going on for 6 years, right? From the time it originally, that is a long time, right? To be in a fight with your federation. And then look how quickly this came about. And Sandra spoke about it earlier about the contingency with the settlement and what that meant. That was only going to take place if you come to an agreement. But look how things quickly move once you get everybody at the table and talking about this, right? I mean, I'm simplifying that, but still, I mean, goodness gracious, we've been working in these silos for way too long. And at the end of the day, you really realize that majority of people do want the same thing, right? And so to me, it's not about picking out one thing. I mean, the resources are massive, but it's not about picking out one thing. It's just more about how we got here and how important that is, and what needs to continue to happen as other things continue to evolve and come up, right?
I'm looking at the clauses within and the provisions to something like resources, and I feel, Lori, please correct me if I'm wrong, but I feel like for a really long time that was kind of what was taking precedence over something like a concept like equal pay. For a really long time it was about hey, can we not play on terrible surfaces? It's hey, can we not play on artificial turf? It's hey, can we have a better per diems or better travel accommodations for us?
Even the
hey,
schedule
you think that we are just not less than, right? That's actually the general thing. Hey, you could care and not think that we're less than is basically what it comes down to, right? It's just
exactly. I think the schedule predictability is something that I almost circled in a little bit on. Is that because the NWSL is such a important part of these players' lives, because that's how they're getting a lot of their payment as well. That's their job, that the planning of the schedule for international breaks needs to be more deliberate and planned out ahead of time, so these players can go to their clubs teams and know exactly when they're going to not be there, what games they're going to be missing, if any, and plan that out, quote, as far in advance as possible. So hoping that that's a really good step forward as well in the scheduling of it all.
Yeah, for sure. And I've loved just reading the reactions or hearing from obviously the players themselves. Obviously within the news announced earlier this morning, Becky Sauerbrunn, president of the U.S. Women's National Team PA, said within the release that the accomplishments of the CBA are a testament to the incredible efforts of the women's national team players on and off the field. The gains we've been able to achieve are both because of the strong foundation laid by the generations of national team players that came before and the current team, and through our union's recent collaboration with our counterparts at the USNSTPA and leadership at U.S. Soccer. We hope that this agreement and its historic achievements in not only providing for equal pay, but also in improving the training and playing environment for national team players will similarly serve as a foundation for continued growth of the women's soccer, both in the United States and ahead. I also really appreciated what Margaret Purse, Mitch Purse saying a little bit, adding some more depth or some more interest in terms of what this can mean or what it does, what the type of weight that it holds. And she mentioned her dad in some quotes here saying, "My dad always told me that you don't get rewarded for doing what you're supposed to do." and paying men and women equally is what you're supposed to do. So I'm not giving out any gold stars, but I'm grateful for this accomplishment and for all the people who came together to make it so. I love that. And I got to say, she's not wrong. You know, Mitch Purse, once again, coming through with with the correct take,
I love this.
you know?
Yep.
Yeah, I absolutely love it. Lori, I guess I just want to, in terms of maybe starting to close this segment out with everyone who has joined us live. And it's so funny. I hate to even do that. Like, I remember, I think when we did this with the NWSL, Sevilla, we were like trying not to get choked up on this thing. But you're someone who has been in the space. You played the game. You've been in this space. You have heard, known, seen what it is firsthand to sort of go through this. And with these last recent 6 years specifically, these aren't just your teammates. These are your friends going to bargaining tables and doing this. What does it mean to sort of have this finally kind of come to a close and know that at least through 2028, these players can just focus on their game and go out there and be people and be soccer players?
Well, listen, knowing the group of these people that are my good friends, it won't just be about playing soccer. And exactly to Mitch Purse's point, or Margaret Purse, excuse me, that, listen, this is a moment to be celebrated, no doubt. And let's enjoy that. And also there's still work to be done, right? In a lot of different areas. So I think that is not something that should be overlooked either. But this is years and years, right? And I think this group of current players, to continue this, the longevity of this fight and the consistency of it, right? Because it has taken its toll behind the scenes, no doubt. And to go into basically a fight with your federation is not easy, right? And then continue to put on the jersey every single month, right? Or however many times throughout the year. So for me, it's a point of celebration. This is a milestone, and credit to Cindy Parlow-Cone as well for the Mount and a lot of people behind the scenes in the federation who really worked hard as well to understand where the players and the women were coming from in all this, because I think that was always an issue, is not actually listening, right? To this is what we're asking for. And I think Cindy set the precedence for that, to really start deeper conversations. And then, for me, it's a celebration, but also congratulations to all the players that have been involved. But no doubt, always work to be done. And so I think it's more of us need to continue to get involved in the conversation on a deeper level. And hopefully this invites more and more people in.
I love that. Let's close out on that. We want to thank everybody for joining us today as we celebrate the historic CBA for the two national teams here with U.S. Soccer Federation. Thanks everybody for joining us and listening to our takes. Let's celebrate. We often talk about that there was a time that we felt that there weren't a lot of dubs to celebrate, but this is definitely one, and we're going to do that for as long as we can. So thank you everyone for listening. Get out there and celebrate. Tell people about this new historic news and share it. Make sure you follow us on TikTok, Twitter, and Instagram at Attacking Third. We're on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, and anywhere you listen to your podcast shows. We're available as video. Subscribe to us at youtube.com/Attacking Third. If you have questions for us, you can leave us a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts with your question, and we'll answer it during a mailbag segment. And Lisa and I will be back for midweek action. We're going to give you another live recap. So join us on Thursday for our takes on Wednesday's games. For Sandra, Herrera, Lisa Roman, and Lori Lindsey, this was Attacking Third.